Resistance, Power, and Technology. And today I'm going to talk about some research from my forthcoming book, just delivered to MIT Press exactly 1 week ago, co-authored with my colleague Adam Fish. It's called Hacker States, and it's about the ways the state uses code, personnel, but also the courts to dominate cyberspace. Okay. States, hackers, and their entanglement with code, networks, and ideology is bewildering. It is often difficult to follow who is working for whom, why, and how. While it makes for perplexed readers, the muddled nature of this intrigue is precisely the point. States, hackers, and code form a schematic subterfuge where identity is muffled and ideology is ambivalent. This chaos is less by design than it is inherent in the nature of the relationship capitalized on by the best resource actor in this affair, the state. Furthering and contributing to this chaos is also a mess of acronyms, pseudonyms, semi-secret agencies, black box software, and refined but imperfect hacker practices. The story I'm about to tell, although it's been told and retold many times, remains difficult to follow. As we know, in August 2016, the world was introduced to the part hacktivist, part entrepreneurial, and likely nationalist Russian shadow brokers, who claim to have breached the Equation Group. The latter is a division within Tailored Access Operations, the NSA's hacking department, which, it is claimed, is so successful because of its sophisticated in-house designed tools, excellent recruitment of talented hackers, and partnerships with technology companies like Verizon, AT&T, and Sprint. The Equation Group may have infected over 500 targets from as many as 42 countries, including Russia, Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, Syria, Mali, and Iran. Its code weapons are sophisticated, and its attack platforms are universal, modular, and customizable. After hacking into the NSA, the shadow brokers attempted to auction their spoils for Bitcoin. It remains unclear whether this auction failed because it lacked willing buyers or whether it was actually a hoax. Nonetheless, after the failure of the auction, the group began releasing as much as a gigabyte of its hacked Equation Group weapons for free between November and January of 2017. On April 14, 2017, they released a 300 megabyte dump of premier hacking tools, including the famous 5 zero-day vulnerabilities that affected most versions of Microsoft Windows operating system, and Fuzzbunch, the Equation Group's version of Metasploit. One of the exploits loaded into Fuzzbunch was Eternal Blue, a remote code execution vulnerability that allowed attackers to gain access to millions of Windows machines. The shadow brokers claim to have acquired it, along with the tool's equation drug, Eternal Blue, and other ominous-sounding weapons from a breach of NSA servers. And an analysis by Kaspersky Lab confirmed the remarkable similarities between the NSA's malware code and the shadow broker's code. Eventually, Eternal Blue evolved into a more serious threat to global cybersecurity as it morphed into WannaCry and was released on May 12, 2017. WannaCry took over 200,000 computers, WannaCry took over Microsoft users' computers, encrypting all data until a Bitcoin ransom was paid. At least 200,000 computers were affected worldwide, and these are conservative estimates, including 60 UK National Health Service boards and trusts, canceling a number of non-emergency procedures across the UK. Based on a series of studies looking at the targets, practices, and IP addresses involved, the NSA then claimed that the North Korean Cyber Espionage Department, the Reconnaissance General Bureau, built the WannaCry worm around its tool. The ransomware attack raised 140,000 in Bitcoins, but these have yet to be redeemed for regular bankable currency. And it's true, the North Korean state has been linked to cyber attacks for profit before. For example, they exfiltrated 81 million from a bank in Bangladesh. As we argue in the book, such excursions represent a key tactical adaptation for North Korea in the context of a punishing international sanctions regime. Yet the story doesn't end there. A few months after WannaCry was disabled, Ukrainian banks, airports, and energy firms were hit with a ransomware attack. Petya, as this new malware was called, would either encrypt data and request a ransom or wipe the infected computer's hard drive and reboot the system. Ukrainian cyber researchers believe the attack originated from Russia as part of a long-running cyber war between the two states. It has been attributed to Sandworm, a Russian state-linked hacking group that targeted the Ukrainian media, government offices, and transportation services, as well as generating blackouts by infecting electrical facilities in late 2015. The target of the Petya malware provides further evidence of state-sponsored nature. It appeared directed at users of the Ukrainian accounting software Medoc, which is widely used for tax filings and financial transactions within the Ukrainian government. It too exploited the same Microsoft vulnerability as WannaCry. The movement of NSA tools and the translation by North Korean hackers into the WannaCry worm, and then the same exploit's reappearance a few months later in recoded and unleashed form by the Russian government, illustrates the flexibility of code and the ambiguities inherent in the state hacker complex, where nothing is quite as it seems. Yet at the same time, it underscores a point that we make in the book about the diffuse and open-ended and scalable character of exposure and criminal victimization in what we call high-breach societies. More so than the bulk exfiltration of user data, which the NSA, for example, has had to build new data centers to store, the entire NSA arsenal hacked by the shadow brokers fits on a memory stick. It can be downloaded, copied, re-engineered, and recorded and recoded multiple times for as long as the vulnerability exists. Code designed by democratic governments is leaked by entrepreneurial yet politically motivated hackers of unknown origin to a despotic regime, which in turn weaponizes the code and unleashes it in an undiscriminating global data apocalypse. A few months later, an improved variant of the same code reappears in a more targeted and politically debilitating strike. Finally, the Shadow Brokers episode also casts light on NSA cyber praxis. The agency aggregates and maintains an arsenal of secret vulnerabilities in the most broadly used software and hardware. Rather than disclosing the evidence of these bugs so they can be patched, it conceals and stockpiles them, and it turns them into surveillance tools and intrusion weapons. The shadow brokers bridge the concrescence of hackers and states, but they are also characterized by a shifting array of ideals and motives. The 2016 auction of NSA tools on Pastebin concluded with a class critique titled "Final Message for Wealthy Elites." They write, "We want to make sure wealthy elite recognizes the danger cyber weapons this message, our auction, poses to their wealth and control. Let us spell out for elites. Your wealth and control depends on electronic data. You see what Equation Group can do. If Equation Group lose control of cyber weapons, who else lose or find cyber weapons? If electronic data go bye-bye, where leave wealthy elites? Maybe with dumb cattle? Do you feel in charge? Wealthy elites, you send bitcoins, you bid in auction, maybe big advantage for you." Yet despite its title, this taunting rant was not the social liberal critique of an elite ruling class. Indeed, an insight into their political ideology comes from a second statement made in April 2017. In this message, the shadow brokers released a letter addressed to US President Donald Trump titled "Don't Forget Your Base." In it, they state their support for the president and the wider sense of disillusionment that helped bring him to power. In a subsection titled MAGA, the acronym for Trump's successful 2016 campaign slogan, "Make America Great Again," the shadow brokers offer the following. President Trump, the shadow brokers is offering our services to you and your administration. Did you know most of the shadow brokers members have taken the oath to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic? Yes, sir. Most of us used to be the deep state everyone is talking about. They claim to have among their ranks U.S. military personnel when paired with their earlier class critique shifts the tone of their communiques from progressive to populist rhetoric. Later in the same statement, they argue against patriotic detractors. Some Americans consider or may be considering the shadow brokers traitors. We disagree. We view this as keeping our oath to protect and defend against enemies, foreign and domestic. These statements seek to reinterpret the hack of NSA servers as an act of patriotic transparency and an attempt to destabilize elite hegemony. Their political identity, if their claims are to be taken seriously, is not a diversion, false flag, or a mask. Finally, they supplement this line of reasoning in an earlier section in which they describe what the Trump supporter does and does not care about. Your supporters don't care what is written in the New York Times, Washington Post, or any newspaper, so just ignore it. Don't care if you swap wives with Mr. Putin, double down on it. Putin is not just my friend, he's my BFF. Don't care if the election was hacked or rigged, celebrate it. So what if I did? What are you going to do about it? Don't care if you're popular or nice, get her done. Obama's failed thinking he could create compromise. No compromise. Don't want foreign wars, do want domestic wars. Drain the swamp, destroy the nanny state. Don't care about your faith. You sound like a schmuck when you try to say God things. Do support the ideologies and policies of Steve Bannon, anti-globalism, anti-socialism, nationalism, isolationism. Ars Technica's Sean Gallagher called this memo a white supremacist, isolationist, anti-globalist message. Whether we can believe the shadow brokers' claims to be US citizens with libertarian, populist, and nationalist impulses and ties to the deep state is beside the point. The shadow brokers' efforts illustrate the entanglement of political ideology or its illusion, state agencies, surveillance technologies, illicit hackers, and bugs in corporate software. They also bring to the fore the point that in this new world, the originally distinct spheres of liberal and radical democratic digital dissent, hacktivism, covert cyber operations, and hostile state cyber incursions are inevitably scrambled, interwoven, and recombined on a global stage with fearsome scale. When the first auction began in late 2016, several believed that the shadow brokers were Russian operatives. A former NSA subcontractor wrote, "Circumstantial evidence and conventional wisdom indicates Russian responsibility, driven more by diplomacy than intelligence, and timed as an escalation to the leaks of emails from the Democratic National Committee." Others see the timing as suspiciously Russian as well. A post falsely claiming to be the final message was released 8 days before Trump's inauguration to minimize any negative impact if the exploits were released during the Trump presidency. As agents of creative destruction and known disruptors of US politics, Russians are a convenient source and scapegoat for such hacks. To further complicate their hacktivist credentials, one might add the circumstances and timing surrounding the original data dump. In terms of the media and news cycle, Friday releases are a well-known political tactic to de-emphasize or bury the impact of a disclosure. Interest in the story generally dies down by the end of the weekend, and Monday begins with a new news cycle. And this is, to a certain extent, what did occur, given that the most important newsworthy items contained in the dump, for example, extensive evidence of the NSA hacking into the SWIFT banking system, did not really get the sort of impact the material warranted. Indeed, the shadow brokers didn't even emphasize that the material was contained in the dump. Additionally, April 14, 2017 wasn't just any Friday, it was Good Friday. So this meant that in addition to general short staffing on most weekends, the holiday ensured that many, if not most, security professionals were enjoying time off, and that if anyone was active, it was probably only script kiddies. In this sense, the goal of the release seems neither a new version of radical transparency nor some weaponization of visibility, but rather a tactic aimed at maximum disruption. Finally, there's another theory about the origins of the shadow brokers. Harold Thomas Martin III was arrested by the FBI's Maryland field office on August 27, 2016, and top-secret U.S. documents were retrieved from his home and vehicle. The New York Times, as well as cybersecurity expert Bruce Schneier, suggest a connection between Martin and the shadow brokers. If Martin is the source of the leaked NSA exploits, he is certainly no longer in control of the code. No one is. And prosecutors have been unable to link Martin to the shadow brokers despite his guilty plea. But linguists that have analyzed their texts and communiques believe it is likely that it is a native English speaker, who is pretending to write in broken, vaguely Russian English. So these problems of attribution speak to the theoretical framework herein developed. It is not who or even why which is most important, but rather the processual and woven nature of this hacker-state ecology. The first WannaCry infections appeared in India, Hong Kong, and Philippines on May 12, 2017. According to England's National Audit Office, by the end of the day, the tally of infected computers worldwide was more than 200,000 in 100 countries. Yet other estimates have put the worldwide figure between 300,000 and 400,000 computers. To further confound matters, the largest number of infected computers were in Russia, followed by Ukraine, India, and Taiwan. The crisis was contained late on Friday afternoon, not by the efforts of Microsoft, but by the malware researcher Marcus Hutchins, the latest actor entangled in this skein of technology tactics and technicians. Hutchins, a 23-year-old security researcher at Cryptos Logic, is credited with stopping the WannaCry ransomware attack by creating a domain name which redirected the attacks to a sinkhole. Hutchins was on a week-long vacation when the UK's National Health Service's computer systems were hit, and before the day was out, he had effectively solved the problem. 3 months later, he was attending the 25th DEF CON in Las Vegas and relishing the accolades he received for defusing the worm. 4 days later, he was apprehended, served an indictment, and charged with 6 computer crimes at McCarran International Airport as he tried to board a flight home. It is unclear if his recent celebrity as a hacker hero led investigators to target him. As of his writing, he's on house arrest, unable to return home to the UK, and faces a potential 40 years in prison. He has pleaded not guilty and remains relatively upbeat about being out on bail and being allowed to use computers, tweeting after bail, things to do during DEF CON, attend parties, visit Red Rock Canyon, go shooting, be indicted by the FBI, and rent supercars. In this story, an exploit originates from a Microsoft bug, is mined and used by the NSA, hacked out by politically motivated yet enterprising shadow brokers, or leaked by an NSA worker, and potentially developed by Russians and North Koreans to create malware with political and economic impact. A cybersecurity hacker foils the malware and is arrested for alleged past transgressions. I want to emphasize the circularity of this example that includes a number of antagonistic characters using meandering and weaponized code with ambiguous ambitions. Once the code is mobile, it traverses a circuit that includes state-on-state hacking, courts, banks, conferences, Ukraine, the UK National Health Service, and others. The line between categories of overt and covert state action, political and subversive ideology, ethical volunteerism and cybercriminality, whistleblowing and espionage implode in the shadow brokers story. So what does this story tell us? How might we ground an analysis of the contours of this emergent state hacker assemblage while remaining cognizant of the material and technological practices they adopt, the legal orders they traverse and are bound by, as well as the individual stories, actions, and experiences that shape and subvert it? Media studies and science and technology studies provide an analytical starting point from which to understand the development of this novel empirical object. Many of the theories that fall under this thematic canopy might be characterized as either optimistic cultural studies or cynical political economic approaches. For example, inspired by the rise of user-generated content in the Web 2.0 era, marked by Google and Facebook, theories like participatory culture and prod usage celebrated the creativity unleashed by a formerly disempowered audience. A decade later, scholars interpreted user-generated content as exploitative digital labor and surveillance capitalism, wherein personal data is extracted and commodified by Google, Facebook, and the like. And theorists continue to debate whether the impact of social media and social movements is emancipatory or whether it shores up hegemonic powers. During the Occupy movement and the Arab Spring revolts of 2012, media studies scholars optimistically characterized decentralized networks as inherently revolutionary. A short time later, the euphoria wore off, and they saw in social media tools for authoritarian surveillance. There's a bounty of critical curiosity here, but agreement on the relationship between subcultural creativity, internet works, underground political action, and the state is tenuous and limited. What is universally conceded by media scholars is the increasingly networked nature of society and its profound social consequences in terms of privacy, vulnerability, criminality, and cyber war. Today we live in high-breach societies generated by chronic social media use, the profit imperative and privacy-reticent big data companies, the development of a competitive state-based cyber battlefield, illicit cybercriminality, hacktivist resistance movements, and what virtual reality pioneer Jaron Lanier calls behavior modification empires. The work of hacktivists and state hackers is possible because of access to information made available by mass social media use and the increasing ability to collaborate and disseminate which these networks afford. In turn, the use of these networks produces profit for the owners of networks, behavior modification empires, and information infrastructures. In this manner, the cultural studies political economy understanding of digital culture captures the simultaneous subcultural creativity and political economic realities that characterize some of the hacker-state relations, but certainly not all. In science and technology studies, we find a more nuanced depiction of what happens between two or more technologically mediated cultures. STS and anthropological investigations into the culture of computing reveal how technologies are socially constructed. They coined concepts such as knowledge co-creation that capture the development of value, meaning, and understanding between two or more technologically mediated cultures. As a unique technology, infrastructures like the internet have the ability to influence and direct human involvement in near invisible manners. Here we can think of the ways infrastructures such as urban water supplies, communication satellites, roads, and the trade and media both constrain and make possible the flow of things, goods, services, and experiences. For the most part, optimistic readings of co-creation generate mutual benefit. For example, designers and consumers co-create to make something better. In an STS co-production framework, hackers that work for states, like those employed by the NSA and GCHQ, may have different values, opinions, and approaches, but ultimately these differences contribute to the creation of a synergistic collaboration between forces around boundary objects, like computer networks and cyber surveillance tools. Similarly, even legal struggles between hacktivists and the courts create a foundation for future structural stability and set the terms of engagement for future confrontations. However, as scholars have correctly identified, an STS perspective often overlooks the impact of hegemonic power and its consequences. Our research, contrary to the STS perspective, reveals how hacker-state relations are less a matter of negotiation or positive collaboration and more a matter of struggle, agonism, and mutual distrust. Other scholars of socio-technical convergence take a more historical view, claiming that brief moments of user agency made possible by the emergence of new network technologies are always followed by periods of closure, corporate monopolization, and restrictive regulation. Here, liberation and exploitation coexist but operate at different scales, times, and regions. Moments of radical openness, collaboration, and mutual benefit often precede market consolidation, limiting regulation, and other forms of erasure and rejection. In this critical historiographical approach, the openness created by the convergence of social media and social movements that made the moment of anonymous and lulzig possible has given way to the current phase where states dominate the promise and potential of hacking. This is the result of progressive hacktivists being prosecuted, incarcerated, or transformed via market incentives to shift from black to white or ethical hackers. As a result, some of these hacktivists work for the state and the corporate forces they once hacked for political gain. In this interpretation, hackers and states are in a dialectical relationship, a game of mutual adaptation across time, with a teleology eventually leading, despite previous moments of surprising competitiveness, towards domination by the player with the most resources. In this scenario, the state succeeds in monopolizing the interface created by hackers and the state. Sometimes, creation is unintended, or what is created is dangerous and beyond the control of the contributing players. The growing literature on the Anthropocene, the present geological period on Earth marked by human domination and multi-species destruction, speaks to this monstrous co-creation of death, despair, and destruction. Philosopher Timothy Morton's concept of the hyperobject describes entities such as climate change, evolution, and the internet that are beyond our conceptualization and control. The struggles between hegemonic states and counter-hegemonic hackers, aided and guided by globalized technologies, is temporally and spatially vast like a hyperobject. Terms have developed to describe this not altogether peaceful coexistence of antagonistic co-creative forces, including the mess, staying with the trouble, and other responses to shared living in times of friction. As a messy and troubling hyperobject, the hacker state defies definitions, linear predictions of its historical trajectory, and clear control by the actors involved in its becoming. We draw from both the historical approach described above, which claims that closure follows openness in socio-technical novelties, and the troubled interpretations of large, monstrous socio-technical co-creations. To this, we are inspired not only by cultural studies, STS, media studies, Anthropocene studies, but from the quantum physics of feminist Karen Barad. In our view, her term entanglement captures the disorienting substance being engineered by hacker and state co-creation. A central aspect of her agential realist approach is Barad's discussion of how within quantum physics, the measuring apparatus, scientists, and the objects being measured are woven together to such a messy degree that it is difficult to know where one starts and another begins. Drawing from the work of physicists, Barad builds off of the research of Werner Heisenberg on uncertainty to examine the, quote, ontological inseparability of interacting agencies. While her research is on subatomic particles, quantum field theory suggests that these principles of entanglement may be as true on the macroscopic scale as they are on the microscopic. In this sense, we do not take quantum physics as a useful metaphor, but as a description of the materiality that weaves together digital cultures. At base, hackers and states are knotted together by photons, electrons, and transistors, all things that abide by the laws of quantum physics. Here, what becomes inseparable in entanglements includes tactics, hacking, surveillance, prosecution, regulation, technicians, hacktivists, state hackers, authoritarians, lawyers, politicians, technologies, hardware such as network infrastructure and routers, and software such as malware, exploit tools, and weaponized code, as well as light and electromagnetics. Agential realism posits that the entanglement of people, instruments, and phenomena generates a trajectory of contingence, ambivalence, and uncertainty. Quantum physics is more than a simile for research on digital culture. These are the material qualities of the relationship between hackers and state actors and the physical substrates that undergird their intra-actions. But while quantum physics provides microscopic parallels to macroscopic entanglements, a more culturally specific term that should evolve that is attentive to the specific problematics of the network technologies within which hackers and states are embedded. Towards this end, we describe the entanglements between network states and hackers as a kludge, a term which describes, quote, an ill-assorted collection of poorly matching parts forming a distressing whole, end quote. The term comes from IT systems administrators who use the concept to describe the messy piecemeal and modular assemblage of components that constitute digital systems. But kludge is not merely a static and dusty pile of cables under your desk. It is a dynamic knot of interwoven parts. Yank one wire or knock over a router, and the whole web tightens. This interlinkage forms a system of feedback that affects the constituent part and which impacts the way the system works. Our conceptualization of the hacker-state kludge includes not only the internet, servers, and hackers for states and hacker activists, but also the courts, laws, and the injected, implanted, and intrusive physical equipment interfaces and interferences of state hackers. Hackers and states are feeding back into a knotted system which disciplines and controls the cognitive freedom and biopower woven into the kludge. But this is also not to say that the legal technical environment co-produced in the state hacker kludge is in any way symmetrically arrayed. On the contrary, the state and its police, courts, laws, and authority monopolize privacy and deploy invasive hacking technologies to gain a substantial edge over hacker activism, and in the process, leave the fate of democracy in the balance. State hacking threatens the legitimacy of the state because it empowers an opaque dark state. The Shadow Broker's story reveals the multifaceted and multi-layered nature of the cybersecurity state. The NSA has a classified budget estimated at $10.3 billion in 2013 and conducts top-secret attack and defense missions throughout the world. Many of these attacks impact civil liberties in dramatic and uncontestable ways. Warrantless wiretaps, internet monitoring, data mining, illegally exfiltrated evidence, metadata collection, encroachment on the U.S. Fourth Amendment, a lack of congressional oversight, package tampering and interception, as well as ransomware attacks are just some of the controversial practices associated with the NSA and their tools. The NSA uses the submarine USS Jimmy Carter to tap undersea fiber optic cables, and Taylor Access Operations has been in operation since 1998. A 50-page classified document, NSA ANT, lists the available tools designed and used by TAO to target Apple, Cisco, Dell, Seagate, and other hardware. State targets of these cyber weapons include governments like China and Mexico, Tor and Firefox users, as well as intergovernmental heavyweights such as OPEC. The U.S.'s involvement in cyber operations is only expanding. Between 2012 and 2016, the U.S. Army Cyber Command expanded to include 133 new Cyber Command teams. The U.S. Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines now each have their own cyber divisions, and this is just what is known. The budgets, attacks, and successes of these state cyber squads become visible only through whistleblowing or hackers like the Shadow Brokers. The militarized cyber dark state is opaque and growing and largely unaccountable. It is therefore dangerous to civil liberties, personal privacy, and the separation of powers. State hacking threatens the courts and the judicial system because it intensifies their use as mechanisms of political control rather than as arbiters for the rule of law. Two indictments relate to the Shadow Broker story, Harold Thomas III and Marcus Hutchins. While the verdict is still out on the fate of these two individuals, we can assume that their prosecution, like others related to hacking and whistleblowing, will be preeminently political affairs. In their investigation into the Shadow Brokers, the FBI found a suspicious online post by Martin. They raided his home and discovered thousands of pages and terabytes of information from the CIA, U.S. Cyber Command, U.S. Department of Defense, and other agencies. He has pled guilty, and his defense team argues that he suffers from a mental illness associated with document hoarding. Whether or not this is a legitimate defense, we can be certain that, like the other show trials of hackers, Chelsea Manning, Edward Snowden, Julian Assange in absentia, Jeremy Hammond, who was entrapped by the FBI and received 10 years in prison, the trials of these two individuals will serve as opportunities to crack down on digital dissent and transparency activism. The trial of Hutchins in particular will likely send a chilling effect to others working in the gray area of cybersecurity, where ethical volunteers in one moment can be cast aside and reframed as criminals with astonishing rapidity. State hacking generates and supports a market for cyber insecurity. While the cliche is what is good for American business is good for America, and while critical academics have grown conditioned to think that a neoliberal cabal conjoins American business and regulators, one topic that is challenged, where this is challenged, concerns the software vulnerability state security services discover and hoard. The story of the shadow brokers begins with an undisclosed vulnerability in Microsoft operating systems. But bugs or weaknesses that affect not only NSA targets and potential criminals, but everyone else using the software. Consider, for example, that Microsoft Windows is the operating system that currently runs on 88% of computers and laptops. Although it's difficult to map how many PCs and laptops are in use globally, we know that the number of computers in use globally surpassed 1 billion in 2008, and that this figure was predicted to double in 2014 or 2016. So conservatively, and using 2 billion as a working estimate, 88% works out to 1.76 billion computers running a Windows operating machine. At risk of contagion by the WannaCry bug were all Windows operating systems that weren't running Windows 10. That represents approximately 60% of Windows market share, and using the above estimates, translates to roughly 1.2 billion computers worldwide. The lion's share of these computers were patched if they had automatic updates enabled, and if not, they could have downloaded the update in the 2 months prior to the release. Yet what is also important to note is that although XP was one of the most vulnerable operating systems to the bug, over 90% of the computers affected were running the still supported Windows 7. Clearly, many users did not have the automatic updates enabled or did not understand the difference between this threat and the cascade of nearly weekly security updates that our network devices increasingly need to function securely. It is impossible to have software weaknesses that enable surveillance while at the same time having secure software. Some have argued that government agencies should always report vulnerabilities to vendors. The answer to the question of what should be done with vulnerabilities rests on what is seen as the role of the government. Right? Defending the harboring of vulnerabilities by state actors means supporting aggressive and offensive intelligence gathering. This furthers a perpetual cyber Cold War state of mass and targeted surveillance, but it also generates global insecurity on an apocalyptic scale. Opposing the practice of vulnerability exploitation by states requires a more defensive, pragmatic, and perhaps isolationist, that is, prioritizing the guarding of personal borders, approach to intelligence gathering and law enforcement. Ethical hacking supports a dominating and exploitative hegemony that consists of the state, corporations, and their proxies. It does this through commodifying a practice with counter-hegemonic potential, such as hacking, and commodifying software vulnerabilities that make everyone's computers less secure. It also incentivizes unethical hacking. The shadow brokers exist in the kludge between state crackers, cyber criminals, transparency hacktivists, and cyber war entrepreneurs. The market for their services empowers the market for vulnerabilities, for zero-day exploits, and other tools of authoritarian cyber power. The market creates a need for cyber mercenaries, wherein the distinctions between explicit and implicit forms of state-sponsored hacking are often intentionally blurred. As the American military has long understood, there are several advantages to having a private military force unaccountable to government and opaque from the public. Consider Hacking Team, the Italian surveillance technology company that builds and retails tools for governments. Hacking Team is an equal opportunity privateer, providing surveillance tools to Egypt, Italy, Russia, Ethiopia, Bahrain, and Sudan. Documents hacked from the company show that their business dealings extend to a host of countries with questionable records on human rights and online privacy, including Azerbaijan, Morocco, the United Arab Emirates, and Kazakhstan. Although they've been dubbed the enemies of the internet, Hacking Team's business thrives in a market where building, customizing, and selling penetration suites, surveillance platforms, and exploit frameworks to states and private entities is a legitimate business practice. Hacking Team's chief crime from this perspective is selling its wares to the wrong state, or states, not necessarily what it was actually selling. This market incentivized model of contractual exfiltration brings the private and public sectors into a tight embrace. It furthers a secret conclave that systematically subverts the entire notion of the state as a public authority, an entity whose whole legitimacy is bound up with questions of accountability. State hacking threatens democracy. What is rapidly vanishing in high-breach societies, perhaps even before it has fully materialized, is the notion that we can be digital citizens, with a range of rights and responsibilities translated for the networked age. Citizenship is an ambivalent concept, both valued in debates about nationalism and migration, and debased in a postmodern world skeptical about the validity of formerly powerful institutions, such as the state, labor unions, and the family. As we align more with political tribes, subcultures, work cultures, causes, and other niche politics, our digital practices have contributed to the fragmentation of institutions and the traditional concepts that undergird them, like citizenship. And the fragmentation of the individual from public communities into difficult to recognize micro-tribes has also posed a problem for state surveillance agencies. Alongside this, the attraction of fast and free social media has created billion-dollar technology companies soliciting and retailing the personal information of users to advertisers. This form of surveillance capitalism also has a powerful state component, in that state security agencies quickly learn to augment their data collection activities through secret collaborations with technology industries. In this sense, the development of digital surveillance and hacking practices partially solves the fragmentation problem because it gives the state new abilities to refilter the population into categories for monitoring and ultimately control. State hacking erodes digital citizenship, which according to Wall, Jorgensen, Bennett, and Taylor requires the security of and interest and trust in infrastructure, an enabling policy framework, freedom to enact citizenship through expression and protest, knowledge of the characteristics of the infrastructure and its affordances, and informed consent. Instead, state cracking requires vulnerabilities in consumer software, which it encourages, fails to disclose, and exploits. For example, the NSA engineered backdoors into cryptographic standards, allowing them to guess passwords and decrypt messages. These efforts, in league with the hacking of citizens and the feeble consumer protection regulations of technology industries, make for a state of insecurity, antithetical to the stable conditions necessary for digital citizenship to arrive. Where digital citizenship requires fearless debate, passive surveillance and active reconnaissance by governments, makes internet users more frequent, more frightened, compliant, and wary of digital expression. Despite this lack of security, governments do not miss an opportunity to discursively capitalize on the fear of hackers and cyber war to expand their surveillance powers. Truncated transparency over select government programs is a feeble trade-off as the state assumes more power over digital citizens. Digital citizenship declines as a result. Are there solutions? Some protests did follow the Snowden revelations, and some governments did seek, however ineffectually, to regulate the surveillance and hacker practices of states. Some have called for the breakup of the NSA, and the sanctions on Russia for hacking the 2016 US election have begun to target companies and individuals involved. But these have thus far been inconsequential. Yet no long-standing social movement has emerged to oppose state hacking. The paucity in protest activity does not necessarily mean a lack of interest, but perhaps, quote, ambivalence, confusion, and lack of knowledge about not just the operations of digital surveillance, but also what can actually be done about them, end quote. Disempowerment, pragmatism, and cynicism result. Many have forgone digital citizenship in exchange for surveillance realism. The belief that state hacking and surveillance is permanent, if not necessary, media systems contribute to this defeatist affect. While blogs can present views that reject surveillance, mainstream newspapers, a study shows, normalize surveillance while de-emphasizing the loss of digital civil liberties. Like ubiquitous and dragnet government surveillance, state hacking, by creating an atmosphere of paranoia for free speakers, radical activists, and hacker activists, has an instrumental role in creating the dull realism associated with the premature decline of digital citizenship. Centralized and monopolized social media reject self-determination. State-harbored software vulnerabilities make security impossible, and Silicon Valley remains largely unregulated. In its wake, botnet fabrication and polemics replace dialogue in the network public sphere, and technology companies and their algorithms continue to work in secret. Poor, politicized, marginalized, gendered, and ethnic communities remain the first and worst hit in high-breach societies. The modes of rejection available, voluntary opting out, technological retreats, digital detoxes, and other temporary respites from the pressures of digital mediation, are luxuries which only the elite can afford. selective refusal, noncompliance, evasion, deliberate ambiguity, confusion, and providing misleading personal information remain options for the digitally literate citizen. Yet here, a mode of neoliberal subjectivity puts the responsibility for privacy on the individual instead of the state. Our idealized radical line of flight into the kludge is a hackback. In this desire, the shadow brokers offer a successful model few others have been able to copy in terms of bravery and impact. But as a white supremacist, isolationist, anti-globalist, capitalist group, the shadow brokers are an epic fail. What we write into becoming are hacktivists with the chutzpah and skills of the shadow brokers, but motivated by a social justice ideology. Thankfully, there's a model for this in the possibly Spanish hacktivist Phineas Fisher, who, with passion and creativity, took as their mission to reveal the duplicity of ethical hacking and the pro-authoritarian hackers by hacking into their private systems around the world. Protest, refusal, obfuscation, and regulation are all legitimate moves for individuals concerned with the impacts of state hacking on the self, society, and democracy. Despite the prosecutorial purges, the draconian sentences, and the terrifying abilities of the state to find, interrogate, turn, and incarcerate hacktivists, our best collective option remains the creation of alternative infrastructures, mesh utopias, and pirate webs. Brief moments of encrypted openness and creativity may follow. The hackers who create tools for espionage and destruction can also engineer technologies for collaboration and creativity. We must ask ourselves, what comes after this internet, highly commodified, surveilled, and manipulated as it is? The internet clutches us. Our rhizomatic senses extend through light and electrons. Another internet is possible. Thanks. Oh, thanks.
Sure. All right. We're going to get ready.
Is it time? That's fine.
Unfortunately, we're running really close on the edge.
Okay, sorry.
So, yeah. So questions